Dulce, a woman with a heart full of kindness, had always cared for those in need, whether they were animals or people. From a young age, her compassion knew no bounds, leading her to become a dedicated nurse. But life took an unexpected turn when she encountered Pedro, a vulnerable boy who needed her help. As she took him into her care, their bond grew stronger, offering Pedro the love and stability he desperately needed. However, Dulce's life, once filled with warmth and love, began to unravel after her marriage to Hugo, a man who would bring betrayal and heartbreak into her world. As the darkness of Hugo's true nature surfaced, Dulce found herself alone, confined to her bed after a tragic accident. The man she thought she loved sold their home, and with it, her very life, leaving her in despair. Yet, amid her suffering, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of Roberto, the new owner of the house. His kindness and care slowly revived Dulce's spirit, and a deep connection blossomed between them. But just as happiness seemed within reach, a shocking revelation from Roberto threatened to shatter everything once again. In a tale that twists from sorrow to joy, Dulce must navigate the pain of betrayal, the struggle for forgiveness, and the hope of a new beginning. Her journey is one of resilience and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell to avoid missing any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Years ago, a heartless husband made a devastating decision. He sold his ailing wife along with their home, unaware of the shocking events that would unfold years later. Dulce, who had been a tender-hearted girl since childhood, always had a soft spot for those in need. She would often bring home stray cats, wounded birds, and abandoned dogs, much to the concern of her grandmother, Carmen. Carmen, who had taken on the role of raising Dulce after the tragic loss of her mother, would gently warn her, "Dulce, today it's a kitten, tomorrow it might be a puppy, and who knows what next? Perhaps even a lost child, or, heaven forbid, you might fall in love with someone who has nowhere to call home. Your boundless kindness could one day lead you into trouble." Dulce's enormous capacity for compassion was undeniable, and perhaps it stemmed from the fact that she only had her grandmother to hold on to. This deep-seated need to care for others shaped her path in life. It was no surprise to anyone when Dulce decided to pursue nursing, driven by an unyielding desire to heal and comfort those who were suffering. After completing her studies with exceptional honors, she secured a job at a clinic in the city. Although the daily commute from her small town was grueling, Dulce quickly adjusted to her new routine, finding a sense of purpose and fulfillment in her work. Her grandmother, Carmen, felt a wave of relief and pride seeing her granddaughter flourish, confident that Dulce's future was bright and secure. At the clinic, Dulce found joy in the little things, like sharing a smile or a story with her patients, even though her days often seemed repetitive. But one cold October evening, as she made her way home, something happened that would forever change the course of her life. As she waited at the bus stop, Dulce noticed a small boy sitting alone, his feet swinging aimlessly and his expression filled with sadness. There was something profoundly wrong. The boy had been crying, and his thin, inadequate clothing offered little protection against the biting cold. Moved by a deep sense of concern, Dulce cautiously approached him. "Hi there, are you all right?" she asked gently. The boy's eyes darted toward her, filled with suspicion. Thinking quickly, Dulce rummaged through her bag and pulled out a chocolate bar, a gift from a grateful patient. "You know, this chocolate is really tasty. I was going to eat it myself, but how about we share it instead?" she offered, trying to break the ice. The boy hesitated for a moment before tentatively reaching out for the chocolate. As he devoured the sweet treat, Dulce watched him closely, her heart heavy with concern. It was painfully clear that this boy needed far more than just a piece of chocolate. He needed a warm meal, a bath, and possibly even a haircut. After he finished eating, the boy's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Is there more?" he asked shyly. Dulce's heart ached as she responded, "I'm sorry, that was the only one I had. But tell me, what's your name?" "Pedro," he whispered, his voice filled with a mix of vulnerability and charm. "And how old are you?" she continued. I'm 6, Pedro replied. I'm going to school next year, but Uncle Leon says dumb kids like me can't go to school. Hearing those words felt like a dagger to Dulce's heart. Who is Uncle Leon? She asked softly. He's my mom's husband. He always calls me dumb, Pedro said, his head lowering as his eyes began to fill with tears. And what does your mom say about that? Dulce asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Pedro sighed deeply. My mom is in heaven, with my grandma, grandpa, and Elsa. Dulce tilted her head, her confusion growing. Elsa was our dog. One day she disappeared after Uncle Leon took her somewhere. He said he returned her to her old owner or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but I think she went to heaven too. The more Pedro spoke, the tighter Dulce's heart clenched. It was clear that this little boy had endured more pain than any child should ever have to face, and the thought of what he might have been through sent a cold shiver down her spine. Desperate to help, Dulce looked around, searching for a solution. Pedro, why are you out here alone so late? It's freezing, and you don't even have a hat, she asked, her concern deepening. Pedro looked down at the ground, hesitating. Uncle Leon was drinking today and got into a fight with some men. They threw a stool at me, but it didn't hit me. I got scared, dressed quickly, and left the house, but I couldn't find my hat. When he drinks, I come here and wait until it's safe to go back. But I think it's going to take a while this time. Every word from Pedro felt like another stab to Dulce's already aching heart. She had heard many sad stories during her time at the hospital, but this one felt different. It struck her to her core. She briefly considered taking Pedro to the police, but one look into his eyes changed her mind. Instead, she decided to take him home with her. Pedro, how about I take you to my house? There's cake, tea, a dog, and 3 cats. Would you like that? She asked, trying to sound cheerful. Pedro seemed unsure. My mom always told me not to go with strangers, he said, his voice trembling with fear. Dulce knelt to his level, her eyes filled with warmth and reassurance. I understand, but I'm not a stranger. I'm a nurse, and my job is to help people. Right now, I want to help you. Will you come with me? Pedro shivered, his fear palpable. But what if Uncle Leon gets mad? He hits me, he whispered. A surge of anger and protectiveness welled up inside Dulce. This has to stop, she said firmly. Just then, the bus arrived. Without hesitation, Dulce took Pedro's hand and led him onto the bus. As they rode together, Dulce watched Pedro closely, worried he might panic or become frightened. But the boy simply stared out the window in silence, as the bus carried them both toward the warmth and safety of Dulce's home. Carmen wasn't particularly thrilled when she first learned about the situation with Pedro, but she did her best to hide her displeasure. Despite her reservations, she took it upon herself to care for the boy. She fed him a warm meal and then made her way to the neighbor's house, where she knew there were children, to request some clean clothes for Pedro. After a short while, she managed to find some suitable garments, bathed the boy, dressed him, and settled him in front of the television to watch cartoons. Meanwhile, she and Dulce began discussing the matter more seriously. Are you suggesting that this is child kidnapping, Grandma? Are we taking someone else's child? Dulce asked, a hint of anxiety in her voice. Carmen murmured, You know what the right thing to do is. You should take him to the police. Dulce, however, was firm in her response. I can't do that. Tomorrow, I'll speak with Mrs. Yolanda, our medical director. She'll know how to guide us. With that, the conversation was set aside, at least for the moment. That evening, Dulce confided in Dr. Yolanda, whom she deeply trusted. Dr. Yolanda was not just a remarkable professional, but also a person of great integrity and leadership. After hearing Dulce's account, the doctor's concern grew. He has visible marks from being hit, Dr. Yolanda pointed out gravely. We must report this and take him to the authorities. Dulce's heart sank at the thought. But Miss Yolanda, if I hand him over to the police, they'll place him in an orphanage, and I won't be able to help him, she expressed, her worry evident. Don't worry, Dulce, Dr. Yolanda reassured her. I have connections within the police force and child protection services. We'll handle this by the book, ensuring you won't face any legal repercussions if his stepfather tries to accuse you of kidnapping. Thus began a daunting journey through a bureaucratic maze, filled with endless explanations, stacks of documents, and tiresome paperwork. It was an incredibly challenging time for Dulce, but within the labyrinth of child protection services, she found compassion and understanding. The authorities promised their support, and even social activists stepped in to help, with some offering to publicize her story in the media. It was an overwhelming period for Dulce, yet she pressed on, and through the unwavering efforts of those around her, she finally succeeded in becoming Pedro's legal guardian. The day it became official was one of the happiest moments in Dulce's life, a bright light amid the storm. Over time, a profound bond formed between Dulce and Pedro. She became a central figure in his life, offering him the stability and love he had been denied. Even Grandma Carmen, initially skeptical, grew to see Pedro as her grandson, enveloping him in her warm and nurturing embrace. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Meanwhile, Pedro's stepfather, who had been lost in a haze of alcoholism, failed to grasp the gravity of the situation. It wasn't until days later, when he sobered up and realized that Pedro was no longer at home, that panic gripped him. Fearful that something had happened to the boy, and too cowardly to seek help from the police, he chose to disappear, more concerned with his fate than Pedro's well-being. During this time, Dulce poured every ounce of her energy into caring for Pedro, her heart overflowing with kindness and dedication. The love and care she showered upon him began to transform his life in the most beautiful ways. Slowly but surely, Pedro blossomed into one of the happiest children imaginable. Though they lived a modest life, it was the simple joys that filled his heart with contentment. Family members visited regularly, and together, they would visit the graves of Pedro's mother and grandparents. Dulce went to great lengths to track down a photograph of Pedro's mother, a task made difficult by the fact that his stepfather had destroyed everything in a drunken rage. After searching among friends, acquaintances, and distant relatives, she finally managed to piece together a photo album for Pedro. The look of pure joy on his face when she gave it to him was worth every effort. Pedro's love for animals was another bright spot in his life. He took great pleasure in caring for Dulce's cats and spent hours playing with the dogs, especially during the long, warm summer days. These interactions brought a special sparkle to Pedro's eyes, a light that had been missing for far too long. Dulce was meticulous in ensuring Pedro was always well-dressed and groomed. His modern haircut and clean clothes were a testament to her attention to detail. When it came to school, Pedro excelled, benefiting from the small class sizes in their town, which allowed the teacher to focus more on each child. Dulce's unwavering dedication to Pedro was reflected in his happiness and success, as he thrived under her loving care. Each day, Dulce felt an overwhelming sense of belonging and purpose. She cherished the new responsibilities in her life, often finding herself smiling at the memory of her grandmother's prediction. Carmen had once joked that Dulce would bring home a child someday, and now, in a bittersweet twist of fate, that prophecy had come true. Yet, as Dulce embraced this new chapter, she had no inkling that another of her grandmother's predictions was on the verge of unfolding. One seemingly ordinary day at the hospital, Dulce's path crossed with a man who would change her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. Hugo, a strikingly handsome young man, was admitted with a deep cut on his face, in the aftermath of a violent altercation. His appearance, marked by reddened, battered skin and a voice roughened by what seemed like a lifetime of hardship, hinted at a life far from ordinary. Despite his striking looks, Hugo didn't evoke any particular feelings in Dulce at first. She treated him with the same professionalism and care she extended to all her patients, bandaging his wounds and exchanging polite conversation without a second thought. Hugo, who needed a few stitches, eventually recovered and left the hospital, seemingly without leaving a lasting impression. But Hugo wasn't content to let their encounter end there. One day, he unexpectedly showed up during Dulce's lunch break, seeking her out under the guise of gratitude. He seemed harmless, without any apparent ulterior motives. However, as they spoke, something shifted. Out of the blue, Hugo gently took Dulce's hand and confessed, "I can't stop looking at you, Dulce. No matter how hard I try, I can't help but get nervous when I see you. It's like I'm drawn to you, unable to resist admiring you." These words left Dulce bewildered. While she had received compliments from patients before, none had ever spoken to her like this. Dulce instinctively tried to pull her hand away, but Hugo held on firmly, his grip conveying a determination that both unnerved and intrigued her. Her heart began to race, caught off guard by the confidence and intensity radiating from him. As time passed, Dulce began to notice certain peculiarities about Hugo. He always seemed to be alone, his attire never changing, and he would visit during hours when most people were busy with work. His absence from social media, coupled with his lack of connection to family or friends, painted a picture of a man who lived on the fringes of society. He explained his solitary lifestyle as a result of his unique views on life, opinions that set him apart from the majority. This air of mystery, of being a lone wolf among the flock, intrigued Dulce. She found herself increasingly drawn to Hugo's enigmatic personality. Hugo's feelings for Dulce became evident when he presented her with a luxurious bracelet, a gesture that marked the beginning of a passionate relationship between them. For Dulce, who had experienced her fair share of relationships that never evolved into anything serious, Hugo was a breath of fresh air. She had longed for a family and children, but most of the men she had dated weren't interested in those commitments. From the outset, Hugo proved to be different. He expressed a sincere desire for a loving, devoted wife who would bring meaning to his life. In their conversations, Hugo shared his views on a man's role as the provider, the pillar that supports the family. He believed that without this purpose, a man could easily fall into vices and decay. Dulce was taken aback by his traditional yet compelling vision of life. "I thought you were more of an adventurous bachelor, a lone wolf," Dulce remarked. Hugo's response was candid. "I am, but not by choice. The issue isn't with me, it's the world around me. Few women embody the qualities I seek. I've been searching for that one special person for a long time and haven't found her yet. But when I do, I'll never let her go." And so, their relationship blossomed, built on a foundation of contrasting yet oddly complementary values. Dulce was utterly captivated every time Hugo showered her with affection, his sweet words melting her heart like ice cream on a hot day. Her emotions were a whirlwind. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs felt weak, and she found herself lost in the growing connection between them. One evening, driven by her deep feelings, Dulce invited Hugo to spend the night at her house. She used the excuse that it would be unsafe for him to travel back to town at night, even though he had done it countless times before. The real reason, of course, was her desire to be near him, to share more time. To her surprise, Hugo agreed without hesitation, and just like that, he stayed the night. But what was supposed to be a temporary visit turned into something more. The next morning, Hugo showed no intention of leaving. "It's so nice here. I feel at home," Hugo remarked casually as he stroked Grandma Carmen's hunched shoulder. His tone was relaxed, almost too comfortable for someone who was merely a guest. "Visiting is fine, but being home is even better, right?" Carmen responded, her words laced with a hint of sarcasm that Hugo seemed to ignore. Week after week, Hugo returned to visit Dulce, each time staying a little longer until he felt so at ease in their home that he decided to make his stay permanent. However, when Hugo arrived one day with all his belongings in tow, ready to move in, Grandma Carmen's patience snapped. She was direct and unyielding. "You can only stay here if you marry Dulce. Until then, you need to leave." The old woman's tone was sharp, her frustration with Hugo's presumptuous behavior evident. She had never approved of his attitude, and her discontent grew as she watched the tension between Hugo and Pedro escalate. From the beginning, Hugo clashes with the boy, despite Dulce's efforts to explain Pedro's difficult past. Dulce, ever the optimist, dismissed Hugo's behavior as simply a lack of experience with children. "Don't worry," she reassured herself. "They'll get used to each other, and everything will work out. She believed that Hugo's love for her would eventually smooth over the rough edges. When Hugo finally proposed to Dulce, she accepted without a second thought, her heart full of hope for the future. They quickly became husband and wife, but the transition was far from smooth. Pedro, who had grown accustomed to being the center of Dulce's attention, was deeply unhappy about sharing her with Hugo. Grandma Carmen's disapproval only deepened. "That Hugo isn't trustworthy," she warned, her voice tinged with the wisdom of her years. Despite the growing concerns from those around her, Dulce's love for Hugo blinded her to his faults. She clung to the belief that, in time, his true, kind nature would emerge. But then tragedy struck. Grandma Carmen fell ill and, to everyone's shock, passed away suddenly. Though she had been sick often, no one expected her end to come so soon. Dulce was devastated by the loss, and in the wake of Carmen's death, Hugo's behavior took a disturbing turn. 2 weeks after the funeral, Dulce noticed a bruise on Pedro's cheek. Concerned, she asked him what had happened, and Pedro hesitantly explained that he had gotten into a fight at school during recess. Dulce's heart ached at the thought of her boy being hurt, and she vowed to take action against whoever was responsible. But when she dug deeper, Pedro reluctantly admitted that the bruise wasn't from a schoolyard brawl. It was from Isabella, Dulce's close friend. Shocked and bewildered, Dulce listened as Pedro recounted the incident. Isabella had visited their home while Dulce was away, and Pedro, in a moment of childish mischief, had poured water on her shoes, pretending he was cleaning them. Angered by his behavior, Isabella slapped him hard across the face. Dulce could scarcely believe what she was hearing. She and Isabella had been friends since their school days, though their lives had taken different paths. Dulce focused on her studies while Isabella got involved in other things. But no matter their differences, Dulce couldn't reconcile the image of her friend with the idea of someone who would strike a child. What troubled Dulce even more was the realization that Isabella had been in her home when she wasn't there. This revelation sparked a storm of doubt in Dulce's mind. After all, Hugo was her husband, the man who had vowed to be faithful to her, who had professed that she was the only woman in his life. But now, the inconsistencies between Hugo's words and his actions gnawed at Dulce's peace of mind. Unable to shake her suspicions, Dulce hired a private detective. The truth that came back shattered her world. Hugo and Isabella were having an affair. They had been meeting regularly whenever Dulce was at work. The betrayal hit Dulce like a freight train, leaving her reeling in a sea of pain and emptiness. Hugo's behavior grew even more brazen. He began to come home drunk, spewing cruel words at both Dulce and Pedro. He criticized Dulce's appearance, her cooking, and her housekeeping, all while maintaining his secret relationship with Isabella, a secret that was now rapidly becoming common knowledge in their neighborhood. The duality of Hugo's cruelty at home and his continued affair outside drove Dulce to the edge. One fateful day, after an exhausting shift at the hospital, Dulce found herself overwhelmed by the weight of her husband's betrayal. As she prepared to leave for home, a single question consumed her thoughts. How could he do this to me? All day, Dulce had managed to keep her turmoil hidden from her patients and colleagues. But the moment she stepped outside the hospital doors, the dam broke. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably as she walked, feeling like a helpless child lost in a world of pain. In her distraught state, Dulce barely noticed the car speeding around the curve. It all happened in an instant. The screeching tires, the bone-crunching impact, the screams that followed, and then an eerie sensation of weightlessness. Dulce felt a sharp, crushing pain in her chest. She tried to breathe, but something heavy pressed against her, preventing her lungs from expanding. This is the end, she thought as darkness began to close in. Moments later, the world faded away, and she slipped into unconsciousness. When Dulce finally awoke, she was no longer the nurse tending to others. She was the patient lying in a hospital bed, facing an uncertain future. Lucia, a gentle nurse who had just recently completed her studies, sat by Dulce's bedside, holding her hand with a look of deep sympathy etched on her pale face. Her voice was soft and filled with emotion as she spoke. "Can you hear me, Dulce?" The words reached Dulce like a lifeline, pulling her back to the present. "Yes, Lucia, I hear you. I see you," Dulce murmured, her voice surprising her with its frailty. Lucia's face softened with relief. "Don't worry, Dulce. You're in recovery now. Soon, everything will start to get better. I'm so grateful that you're still with us. Incredibly, you survived." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Lucia's words hung in the air as the reality of the situation began to settle in for Dulce. The driver fled the scene, but thankfully, there were witnesses. They saw what happened and immediately called for an ambulance. "You're very lucky, Dulce," Lucia added, her voice trembling slightly. Confusion clouded Dulce's thoughts as she tried to piece together what had happened. "Tell me more, Lucia. What exactly happened to me? What's wrong with me?" she asked, her mind racing with questions. Lucia, maintaining her calm demeanor, replied, "The doctor will explain everything, Dulce. It's better if you hear it from him." As she lay there, still grappling with the shocking shift from caregiver to patient, Dulce's mind swirled with a chaotic mix of thoughts and emotions. She was used to being the one offering comfort, not needing it. While she waited for the doctor, Lucia, sensing Dulce's unease, offered some words of solace. "I know the rules, Dulce, and I shouldn't say much, but everyone here speaks so highly of you. You deserve to know the truth. The impact was severe, your injuries are serious. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but there's always hope, and we'll do everything we can to help you." Dulce closed her eyes, the weight of Lucia's words sinking in. She knew in that moment that her life had been irrevocably altered, split into a before and an after. The gravity of her situation pressed down on her, but there was no turning back. 2 months later, after what felt like an eternity, the hospital finally discharged her. The entire staff gathered to say goodbye, showering her with good wishes for a full recovery, hugs, flowers, and small tokens of their affection. The scene was bittersweet, filled with the warmth of their kindness, but overshadowed by the daunting reality she was about to face. The doctor, before releasing Dulce into Hugo's care, explained in detail the extent of her injuries, specifically, the spinal fracture that would now define her life. He provided Hugo with instructions on how to care for her. The importance of regular massages, the need for specialized rehabilitation, a regimen of medications, and the use of modern wheelchairs designed to make her life as comfortable as possible. But Hugo, who had grown increasingly distant, seemed uninterested. His thoughts were far removed from his wife's plight, preoccupied instead with how her condition complicated his own life. To him, Dulce's survival was an inconvenience. Her death would have allowed him to continue living in her house without any burdens. During Dulce's long stay in the hospital, Hugo visited her only once, citing the excuse that he couldn't manage the house and care for Pedro at the same time. His indifference was a bitter pill for Dulce to swallow, revealing just how little he cared. When she finally returned home, she was met with a heartbreaking reality. The house was in disarray. Pedro, unbathed, was dirty and hungry, having missed school for over a month. The cats that once roamed their home had fled in search of better care, occasionally returning but never staying long. The only animal that remained was the dog, still chained in the backyard, neglected and poorly fed. Pedro, with the limited resources he had, tried his best to care for the dog, often sharing his food with the forlorn creature. Dulce saw all of this but felt utterly powerless. Confined to her bed, she lacked the strength even to sit up in the wheelchair that had been provided by the hospital. Hugo's negligence extended beyond her care. He ignored Pedro's needs and the animals, leaving the burden of basic survival on Pedro's small shoulders. The boy took on responsibilities far beyond his years, fetching food for Dulce, reading to her, and being her only source of comfort. The situation reached a breaking point when Hugo, in a fit of rage, accused Pedro of stealing sausages from the fridge and assaulted him. Desperate and frightened, Pedro sought help from their neighbor, Elena, a courageous woman with a strong personality who had once received clothing from Dulce's late grandmother, Dona Carmen. Elena, outraged by what she heard, stormed over to confront Hugo. She didn't mince words, threatening to call the police if he ever laid a hand on Pedro again. After dealing with Hugo, Elena went to check on Dulce. The sight that greeted her left her horrified. Dulce, once so vibrant, was now a shadow of her former self. "Dulce, what has he done to you?" Elena asked, her voice filled with compassion and disbelief. Without hesitation, Elena took charge of the situation. She bathed Dulce, fed her, and ensured that Pedro was properly cared for. She sent Pedro back to school and began visiting Dulce's house twice a day, before her work in the morning and again in the afternoon, to make sure the family's basic needs were met. Elena's tireless dedication brought a semblance of stability back into Dulce's life, providing her with the daily care she so desperately needed but had been denied for far too long. Hugo's brazen involvement with Isabella stirred a deep fury within Elena, who made no effort to hide her disgust. She confronted the situation head-on, her sharp words cutting through the tension in the air. Dulce, overwhelmed by the betrayal and devastation, broke down into uncontrollable sobs, burying her face in her hands. "Poor you," Elena murmured, her voice softening with empathy. "But don't worry, I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Yet, Hugo, frustrated by Elena's interference and realizing that she was a formidable obstacle, decided to take drastic action. One day, while Elena was at work, Hugo arrived at Dulce's house accompanied by a man dressed in a sharp suit. His excitement was palpable as he greeted Dulce. "My flower, this is a lawyer. He's here to help us sort out some property matters." Dulce blinked in confusion, the words not quite making sense to her. "Property matters? Between us?" she asked, her voice tinged with bewilderment. Hugo's response was chillingly calm. "Exactly. That's why I've brought him. It's time for us to give each other mutual freedom. Let me go, so I can live my life happily." A thick tension settled in the room, growing heavier with each passing second. Hugo was unrelenting, pushing his demands through the lawyer. "I'm not leaving until I get what I'm owed. I want this house as compensation," he declared, his voice devoid of any warmth. The lawyer, clearly in cahoots with Hugo, laid out the paperwork, explaining, "I just need your identification and the house documents. Everything your grandmother transferred to your name. It'll only take a few signatures, and it'll all be over in 5 minutes. We'll both be better off, trust me." Dulce felt the room spin as the weight of Hugo's betrayal crashed over her. She could barely choke out the words as she screamed, "Are you out of your mind? If I give you the house, what will Pedro and I have left? We'll be homeless, and the state will take Pedro away, placing him in an orphanage because I'm disabled." Hugo, unfazed by her desperation, coldly continued, "I've already thought of everything. You'll be moved to a home for the disabled. It's all arranged." But Dulce, her spirit flaring up in defiance, shouted back, "That's never going to happen. Get out of my house. I don't want to see you or your lawyer ever again." But Hugo didn't leave it at that. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Think carefully, Dulce. If you don't let me go, something irreversible might happen. There are a lot of dangers in this house for a child. Boiling water could spill. A faulty wire could cause an electric shock. Or maybe he could just wander off into the woods or drown in the swamp." His words were laced with thinly veiled threats, designed to break her down through fear and emotional manipulation. Terror gripped Dulce as she screamed, a mixture of rage and horror coursing through her veins. She had known Hugo's cruelty, but this level of moral depravity was beyond anything she could have imagined. In a state of sheer helplessness, she signed all the documents he demanded, her hand trembling with a mix of fury and dread. But the worst blow came when Hugo took Pedro away, as he had planned all along. That morning, he had put everything in motion, and now, as Dulce screamed and cried, trying desperately to hold on to Pedro, Hugo heartlessly pushed her aside and sent her spiraling into despair. The pain of losing Pedro plunged Dulce into a deep, dark depression. She stopped eating, drinking, and doing anything to sustain herself. All she wanted was to escape the unbearable torment of her reality. The once bright and hopeful future she had envisioned was now nothing more than shattered dreams and relentless suffering. Dulce was trapped in a vortex of despair, her will to live slowly being eroded by the weight of her loss and Hugo's ruthless betrayal. Amid her depression, Hugo returned with a new blow. He brought home a guest, a young man slightly older than Dulce, with a kind face and confident demeanor. Despite his apparent kindness, there was something in his eyes that hinted at a troubled past. Dulce, lost in her sorrow, felt a fleeting sense of empathy for the stranger. But that sympathy quickly evaporated when she learned the truth. Hugo had sold the house. Not only had he sold it, but he had also sold it with Dulce still inside. The buyer, Roberto, had recently gone through a divorce and was eager to leave the city behind. Hugo had offered him the house at a price far below market value, convincing Roberto that Dulce's life was nearing its end and that soon, no one would be around to bother him. Hugo hadn't even bothered to arrange for Dulce's transfer to a care facility. It was all a lie, a ploy to get what he wanted. "My friend," Hugo had said to Roberto, "you might think about sending her to a nursing home, but that wouldn't be right. She should live out her days here. And where else will you find a deal like this? Think about it." Persuaded by Hugo's twisted logic, Roberto reluctantly agrees to the arrangement. When Dulce learned of this betrayal, the full weight of her helplessness crushed her. She had been reduced to nothing more than a piece of property, sold off without any regard for her humanity or her wishes. The realization that her life was no longer in her control, that others were deciding her fate, plunged her further into despair. The divorce papers that arrived by mail, signaling Hugo's official departure and Isabella's abandonment, meant nothing to Dulce. The only thought that consumed her was Pedro. Where was he? What had happened to her boy? Elena, the neighbor who had been Dulce's lifeline, was unable to visit Pedro because the staff at his new location didn't know her, adding another layer of torment to Dulce's anguish. As the days dragged on, Dulce made a grim decision. She would stop eating and drinking entirely. Death seemed a kinder option than continuing to exist in this living hell, where every trace of hope had been ripped away. Roberto, the man who had purchased the house, did his best to offer help, preparing meals and trying to engage Dulce in conversation. He even suggested taking her outside for some fresh air, but Dulce was resolute in her refusal to interact. She withdrew into herself, refusing his offers, determined to remain in her cocoon of despair. In a moment of utter desperation, Dulce made a shocking request. She asked Roberto to take her back in time, to a place before all the tragedy, before her life had spiraled into this nightmare. The impossibility of the request reflected the depth of her suffering. Roberto, shaken by her plea, crumpled to the ground, overwhelmed by his own emotions. He sobbed uncontrollably, the weight of his hidden guilt and pain breaking through. Then, gathering himself, he approached Dulce with a mix of regret and compassion. He suggested taking her to the capital, where she could find the best doctors, and he promised to do everything in his power to help her. But there was something off about him. His emotions seemed precariously balanced, as if he were on the verge of breaking down completely. Dulce was confused and frightened, unable to fully understand what Roberto was going through. Yet, despite his turmoil, Roberto regained his composure and expressed a genuine desire to help. He offered financial support and access to resources, insisting that there was hope, that something could be done to improve her life. Dulce could hardly believe the surprising gestures from Roberto. His care and affection were beyond anything she had expected, almost angelic. He lifted her gently, placing her in the wheelchair, and tended to her meals with tenderness. He even took her outside to breathe fresh air, becoming a true guardian in her time of need. Roberto went so far as to arrange for local beauty professionals to visit the house, ensuring Dulce had a fresh haircut and manicured nails, small gestures that helped lift her spirits amidst the crushing weight of her depression. When Dulce mustered the strength to ask Roberto for help in bringing Pedro back, she discovered that it would be best to wait. She was soon to move to the capital for her rehabilitation, and during that period, Elena, her steadfast neighbor, wouldn't be able to care for Pedro. Reluctantly, Dulce accepted this temporary arrangement. During a visit to Pedro at the foster home, Dulce witnessed the pure joy on the boy's face. His happiness at seeing her was infectious, and she promised him that as soon as she was strong enough, she would bring him back home. Pedro, with innocent delight, told her that day would be the happiest of his life. Those visits to Pedro brought a flicker of light into Dulce's dark world, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming despair. True to his word, Roberto took Dulce to the most advanced medical clinic in the region. The doctors, moved by her story, were hopeful despite the months of neglect and stress she had endured. They saw the potential for recovery, and Dulce, driven by the prospect of being with Pedro again, vowed to do whatever it took to regain her mobility. Thus began the arduous journey of rehabilitation. As the months passed, something profound began to develop between Dulce and Roberto. Dulce came to realize that her feelings for him went beyond gratitude or friendship. She saw in Roberto the man she had once believed Hugo to be, the ideal partner, someone who truly cared for her. But Dulce was determined not to become a burden to Roberto. She made a promise to herself that she would only reveal her feelings once she could walk again. And then that long-awaited day arrived. With the support of crutches, Dulce took her first steps on her own. The doctors, who had been with her through every grueling moment of her recovery, applauded her success. This achievement was not just a milestone for Dulce, but also a victory for the entire medical team that had supported her. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Roberto watched Dulce's triumph with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by her strength and determination. A few days later, as they strolled through the hospital park, Roberto by her side to steady her, Dulce decided it was time to fulfill her promise. She confessed her love for him, expressing how much he had come to mean to her. Roberto listened intently, holding her hand, but the expression on his face was unreadable. When Dulce finished speaking, Roberto took a deep breath and said, "Dulce, thank you for your courage and sincerity. I have to tell you that I love you too. I've loved you for a long time, but there's something I need to confess." Roberto's voice trembled as he continued, "I feel a terrible guilt, Dulce. The accident that changed your life, it was my car that hit you at that intersection. My wife was driving, but I helped cover up the crime. I got out of the car, saw you lying there, and I thought you were dead. We went home, and I calmed my wife, who was hysterical. But the guilt has been eating me alive. I started to wonder, what if you were still alive? But at that moment, all I cared about was keeping my wife calm. Later, I found out she was cheating on me with her boss. We divorced, and I gave her almost everything, but I couldn't find peace. My heart is restless, and I don't know if I can ever be free of this guilt. If you can, please forgive me." Dulce was utterly stunned by this revelation. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man she had grown to care for deeply, the one who had been her beacon of hope, was also the cause of her suffering. Roberto's confession left her reeling as she tried to process the enormity of what he had just told her. Her heart was torn between the shock of his betrayal, the pain of the truth, and the love she still felt for him. Needing time to think, Dulce asked Roberto for a moment alone to reflect on everything she had just heard. She was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, surprise, hurt, and the love that had blossomed despite everything. Roberto, sensing her need for space, quietly left, allowing Dulce the solitude she required to grapple with the decision that now lay in her hands. From this moment on, Dulce's recovery progressed steadily, with only a small hurdle left to overcome. Her dedication to the regimen and consistent exercise paid off, and Pedro was finally brought back from the orphanage. His return filled the house with a renewed sense of warmth, and he was overjoyed to be home again. He quickly formed a bond with Roberto, who, despite the lingering tension between him and Dulce, continued to care for her in every possible way. He ensured that she had all the medications she needed and provided the best equipment to aid in her recovery, all while respecting her need for space. Dulce, meanwhile, wrestled with her emotions, trying to decide if she could truly forgive Roberto and move forward. Roberto, understanding the gravity of the situation, patiently waited, never pressuring her for an answer. Then one day, in a gesture that spoke volumes, Dulce surprised Roberto by preparing a breakfast of fresh coffee and pancakes. She invited him to sit and share the meal with her. Roberto, caught off guard by this unexpected act of kindness, looked at Dulce with a mix of surprise and hope. As she sat down at the table, it became clear that perhaps the wall between them was beginning to crumble, and forgiveness might be within reach. Pedro, delighted by the meal, sat nearby, his mind filled with thoughts of the promised treats and the joy of having his family together. Although a trace of tension lingered, the atmosphere hinted at a fresh start. "Pedro, can you leave us alone for a moment? We need to have an adult conversation," Dulce gently requested. With her eyes fixed on Roberto, she could see the anticipation in his gaze. His heart raced as he waited for her next words. Then, with a deep breath, Dulce spoke the words that would change their lives. She forgave Roberto. The two of them decided, at that moment, to embark on a new journey together, determined to build a united family. The smiles they exchanged conveyed the seriousness and sincerity of the bond they were forging anew. Gradually, their union blossomed into something truly beautiful. As Dulce observed the transformation within their home, she began to sense a new, unexpected joy growing inside her, a promise of new life. The painful experiences that had initially brought them together now seemed like the foundation for something extraordinary. In a heartfelt gesture of love, Roberto proposed to Dulce, and the joy of their engagement was soon followed by even more thrilling news. Dulce was pregnant. The happiness that engulfed her was beyond anything she had imagined, marking the beginning of a wonderful new chapter in her life. So absorbed was she in this newfound joy that she didn't even notice the whispers circulating about Hugo's return to town. Hugo, now abandoned by his city partner and left with nothing, had returned to the town in a state of utter despair, with nowhere to go. He wandered the streets aimlessly, haunted by the choices that had led him back to the place he once called home. One night, as he walked through the familiar streets, he found himself standing in front of his former house. A flood of emotions surged through him as he gazed at the soft light glowing from the windows. The scene inside was both familiar and shockingly different. Through the window, Hugo saw something he hadn't expected. His ex-wife, Dulce, looking more radiant than ever, bathed in the warm light of the room, with a visible pregnancy that told of a new life on the way. Dulce and Roberto were there, their love for each other clear in the way they tenderly showed affection for Pedro, who was happily playing with Lego blocks. The joy that filled the house was almost tangible, a stark contrast to the emptiness Hugo now felt. He watched, overwhelmed by the realization of all he had lost, as his former life continued without him, more vibrant and full of love than ever before. As we conclude this heartfelt and emotional journey, it's time to reflect on the powerful lessons we've witnessed. Dulce's story is one of resilience, forgiveness, and the incredible strength that love can bring, even in the darkest of times. What have you learned from this story? Take a moment to think about the profound messages embedded in Dulce's experiences and share in the comments below one thing you've learned and plan to bring into practice in your own life. Your thoughts and reflections matter, and we'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories and life lessons. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.